The British Empire was once the most powerful empire in the world. It had the strongest military, the most money, and by far the most land. At its peak, Great Britain actually had over 13 million square miles of land, which is twice the size of Russia. But today, Britain itself only controls about 95,000 square miles of land, which is roughly the size of Oregon. Now you might think this happened over a couple of centuries, but what if I told you that Britain actually lost all of that land within 50 years? Now you might be asking how all of this is possible. Well, luckily for you, I think I know the answer. So first, how did it all start? Well, the British Empire wasn't built in a day. Back in the late 1500s, England was just a baby country. Compared to Spain and Portugal, who were already dominating global trade and exploration, England was just another European kingdom looking for a way to expand its influence. But it wouldn't be long until all of this changed. The first big step was to colonize North America. In 1607, England established Jamestown, its first permanent colony in what is now the United States. Over the next century, more settlements popped up, eventually forming the 13 colonies. But while North America was important, it's not what made Britain rich. This is because the real money was in the Caribbean. You see, in the early 1600s, when Britain seized islands from the Spanish and other European rivals, it took control of Barbados and later expanded to Jamaica after capturing it from Spain. These islands would actually turn out to be absolute money machines for the British, all because of one thing: sugar. Sugar had actually become one of the most sought-after commodities at the time. The Caribbean's warm climate, rich soil, and long growing seasons made it the perfect place for sugarcane to grow. European demand for sugar skyrocketed, making it an incredibly profitable industry that made Britain rich. This cash crop turned Britain into a major player in global trade, and now the empire not only had the will to conquer other nations, it had the money to do so. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Britain had its eyes on India. You see, the textile and spice trade in India was booming, and there was a lot of money to be made there. Money that Britain wanted. So Queen Elizabeth granted a royal charter to a group of merchants, giving them exclusive trading rights in the East Indies. Together they formed the British East India Company. Initially, the company focused on trade, but competition with the Dutch and Portuguese pushed it to establish its own military and alliances in India. This is when the company's influence began to expand rapidly, using a mix of diplomacy, military force, and local alliances to tighten its grip on Indian rulers. By the mid-1700s, Britain wasn't just competing in global trade, it was actively seizing land and resources to build an empire that spanned multiple continents. The riches of India, from textiles to spices and raw materials, poured into Britain's pockets, further fueling the empire's desire to expand. British merchants and officials became incredibly wealthy, and the control over India became one of the key pillars of Britain's growing dominance. However, while Britain flourished, resentment among the local population was beginning to boil. Fast forward to the 1800s, and Britain was at its peak. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, making Britain an even stronger force. Factories were churning out goods at an unprecedented rate, and Britain's control over raw materials from its colonies allowed it to dominate global trade. Steamships and railways made it easier to move resources and troops, further solidifying Britain's hold on its empire. Britain was seeing rapid economic growth, and the empire could not be happier. But things were about to get messy. You see, not everyone was happy with the vision that Britain had for Europe. One of these people you may have heard of. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon sought to expand French influence and establish dominance over the continent, while Britain, with its strong naval tradition, aimed to prevent any single power from controlling Europe. Tensions between the two had been building for years, and after Napoleon rose to power following the French Revolution, the rivalry escalated. Britain funded coalitions of European allies to resist French expansion and imposed a strict naval blockade to weaken Napoleon's economy. In response, Napoleon introduced the Continental System, a trade embargo designed to cripple Britain by cutting it off from the European markets. However, this strategy ultimately backfired, as it hurt France's economy more than Britain's and led to widespread resentment among its allies. The Royal Navy played a crucial role in blockading France and defeating Napoleon's forces at sea, particularly at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. This victory made Britain even stronger. The empire was able to seize valuable territories from France and its allies, expanding its empire even further. Britain took control of South Africa, Sri Lanka, and various islands around the world. These acquisitions strengthened British trade routes and naval dominance, ensuring that the empire remained unmatched on the global stage. India, often called the crown jewel of the empire, officially became a British colony in 1858 after the British government took over the East India Company. Britain then turned India into a money-making machine, using its resources and manpower to fuel the empire. In Africa, Britain was also taking over. The scramble for Africa in the late 1800s was a period of intense competition between European powers, driven by the desire to control Africa's vast resources and strategic territories. European nations, including Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, rushed to claim as much land as possible, often with little regard for the existing African kingdoms and societies. This was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers divided Africa among themselves without consulting the local populations. Britain, with its superior naval power and economic strength, secured control over key regions, such as Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and Nigeria. These territories provided valuable resources, including gold, diamonds, and rubber, further building Britain's massive economy. By this point, Britain was on its way to controlling around 25% of the land on Earth. The empire looked unstoppable, but they had already seen a lot of cracks in their armor. The first major hit had been the American Revolution. Britain had been treating its American colonies like a cash cow, taxing them heavily, but the colonists weren't having it. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," became their rallying cry. Britain figured it could squash the rebellion quickly, but they underestimated the Americans, and France stepped in to help. Things got messy, and by 1783, Britain had lost its 13 American colonies. It was a humiliating defeat, but the empire still had plenty of land. For now. Losing America forced Britain to rethink its game plan. It shifted focus to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. But the cracks in the empire's armor kept growing. The 20th century was about to bring even bigger problems. You see, World War I changed everything. The war was devastating for Britain, both in terms of human loss and economic strain. The British Empire had entered the war in 1914 as one of the world's greatest powers, but by the time it ended in 1918, it was left battered and deeply in debt. The war had drained Britain's financial reserves, forcing it to borrow heavily from the United States. Additionally, the war had exposed Britain's dependence on its colonies. Troops from across the empire, India, Canada, Australia, Africa, and the Caribbean, had been called to fight because Britain could not fight on its own. However, once the war ended, many of these colonial soldiers returned home, questioning their place in the empire. If they had fought and died for Britain, why were they still being treated as second-class citizens? The desire for independence grew stronger, and Britain now had to deal with rising nationalist movements. The war had also weakened Britain's control over its territories, as economic instability and political unrest began to spread. Ireland, for example, had already been pushing for independence, and the war only accelerated its path toward breaking away. The empire was still standing, but it was beginning to wobble. Colonies like India, Ireland, and Egypt had sent soldiers to fight, and now they wanted something in return. More freedom. The war showed just how much Britain relied on its colonies, and those colonies started demanding more. Then came the interwar years. The period between World War I and World War II was marked by growing unrest and instability within the British Empire. Nationalist movements began to gain traction across the empire, fueled by frustrations over economic exploitation and racial inequality. Ireland fought for independence and won in 1922. This was massive for British colonies because it showed that freedom from Britain was possible. In Africa, resistance to British rule was growing as local leaders began pushing back against colonial oppression. Revolts and uprisings in Kenya and Nigeria signaled that Britain's control was slipping. Meanwhile, the Indian independence movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, was gaining serious momentum. Gandhi's strategy of non-violent resistance, including protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience, inspired millions to challenge British rule. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, where British troops killed hundreds of unarmed protesters, only intensified calls for independence. The British government attempted to maintain control through a mix of political concessions and repression, but the demand for self-rule was growing stronger by the decade. By the late 1930s, it was clear that India's independence was no longer a question of if, but when. The empire was hanging by a thread, and then came the final blow: World War II. If World War I was a punch in the face, then World War II was a bomb to the face. Britain was already struggling, and another expensive war pushed it over the edge. Plus, the world had changed. The US and the Soviet Union were the new superpowers, and both were against colonialism. The first big loss was India. By 1947, Britain simply couldn't hold on to it anymore. This was the moment the empire truly started crumbling. After India, it was like a domino effect. Ghana became the first African nation to gain independence in 1957. The 1960s were a blur of decolonization. Kenya, Nigeria, and dozens of other countries broke free. Britain just kept losing its grip. The money wasn't worth it, resistance was too strong, and the world was watching. An empire that had taken centuries to build was collapsing in just a few decades. By the 1990s, there was almost nothing left. The biggest remaining piece was Hong Kong. Britain had ruled it since the 1800s, but a 99-year lease meant it had to return the territory to China in 1997. That handover was the final page in the empire's story. For all intents and purposes, Britain's time as the global superpower was over. Today, Britain still has 14 overseas territories. Places like the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, and Bermuda, they recognize the British monarch, but are still self-governing. Compared to the empire that once ruled a quarter of the world, Britain today is like a blip on the map. The British Empire was the biggest in history, but like all empires, it just couldn't stand the test of time. That's all I have, but if you guys liked the video, if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.